Oh my goodness. Mm. Okay. Start off light. Catastrophe. What does that word mean? When I say catastrophe, how would we define that?
Disaster,
Mm-hmm.
destruction,
Mm-hmm.
An incident that causes harm.
Mm-hmm.
When my mom attacks the Senate, the House of the legislature.
That moment was, yeah, a catastrophic moment, you said.
I think,
Anyone know? Sorry, Sandy, go ahead.
are they also unexpected?
Unexpected.
Mm.
That's a good one as well. It's actually derived from Greek, meaning overturning, meaning flipping over, basically. And then when it gets to the time of the not the Septuagint, of the Greek New Testament, when it's sort of defined there, it carries on that meaning of ruin, of utter destruction. So we talk about disaster, about destruction, about disaster. It works out very similarly. There was a scholar named Alan Mintz. He wrote a book called Churban, which is responses to catastrophe in Hebrew literature, focusing more on our 20th century catastrophes. He writes that we may define generally catastrophe as a destructive event whose horror derives from a bursting of paradigms of explanation. It was the cognitive disorientation that the destruction of Jerusalem provoked, which made it a catastrophe. So what does that mean? It means that the people at that time could not fathom a world in which the temple would be destroyed. The temple is the house of God, right? The temple's where God lives, so to speak. And so they always believed that no matter what else happened to them, the temple would stand. God would protect them. God would save them. No matter what was going on around them, God's house was inviolable. It could not be destroyed in any way. So in this moment of 586 BCE, when the Babylonians come in and they destroy the temple and exile the people, this was a catastrophic event. It turned their entire world upside down. And their entire life, their entire way of thinking, their entire world came crashing down around them. So it was more than the destruction of a building, right, of a temple. It was a complete destruction, a devastation of their entire way of thinking about God and the world. And this is then expressed in the poems we're about to read today, which comprise Lamentations. Lamentations is, again, a fascinating work. It consists of 5 distinct poems that commemorate the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE by the Babylonians, and again, the exile from Judah. And it reflects on the suffering that has resulted from the destruction and the dislocation, right? So that's really what it focuses on. It focuses on the pain, sort of the suffering, the emotions of the after effects of catastrophe. What does it mean to live through something like that? That is a disaster, that is unforeseen, that is in your mind unheard of, an impossibility came true. Something that you couldn't even dream about in a way happening has occurred. From a historical standpoint, this is always part of the conversation, right? There's a historical reality and a biblical reality. And I'm going to define those as different for the moment. The historical reality is that no matter what the Israelites did, the people of Judah did, Babylonia was coming. And Babylonia was not going to be appeased, not going to be happy. Babylonia was a destructive force in that time. And no matter what they did, Babylonia was probably going to do the exact same thing. You know, they were, again, looking to take over the world, right? And Judah was in their way at that point in time. And they came in and they destroyed everything. That's historical. From a biblical standpoint, this whole occurrence happens for only one reason, that the people strayed from their faith. The people did not observe God's commandments. They did not observe Jewish teachings. They ignored. Remember last year we studied a lot, right? The words of the prophets, right? And the prophets were always saying, hey, you guys better act the correct way, because if not, God's going to come down and bam, give you one of those, you know, and the people, oh, we're fine. We're going to do whatever we want. And then, of course, destruction does happen, right? So the Babylonians are not mentioned once in this text, but God's mentioned, and God's mentioned frequently as saying that God is the one responsible, you know, for bringing about the punishment. That all this that has happened is God's will, is God's decision to punish the Israelites for everything that went wrong, and the Babylonians are merely a tool of the destruction, right? God used the Babylonians to punish the Israelites as God works throughout history, right? God's hand is behind it. Theological questions aside, because we're going to dive into those as well, you know, but that is really a big part of the book, that God caused this, God allowed this to happen because of the Israelites' behavior, right? So it wasn't capricious. You know, it wasn't God just saying, hey, you know what? Go ahead. You know, it's a response. It's a divine response to human behavior. The people act in a certain way, and then God says, you know what? Enough. And there's actually a midrash that literally imagines God almost like packing a suitcase. You know, God's in the temple, you know, and God's going, you know what? I'm leaving. This isn't my house anymore. You know, it used to be, but you guys started, you know, behaving terribly. I'm going to leave. And it's when God's presence leaves the temple, that's when the Babylonians come in to destroy everything. So these chapters, you know, these poems, they are similar, but they actually come from different perspectives. The first one is about the temple in Jerusalem itself. It describes sort of the resulting environment that the people are left in at the time. Chapter 2 is more about God and God's role in the destruction. 3 is a personal lament. For the most part, it's actually a very long book. It's 66 verses, but it is mostly a personal lament. And then it gets to be a communal lament by the end. And then 4 is an explanation of the suffering, again, of the people's inhabitants. It's very people-focused. And 5 is similar, again, the duress of the people left behind. It seems to be more, that one a little more liturgical. Actually, as we'll see, one of our prayers actually comes from the end of that book, the end of Lamentations. It sounds depressing as all get out. I'm not going to tell you no, but there's a lot in the scrolls as well, especially towards the end, about hope, right? It's about survival, that even though they've gone through this horrific, catastrophic event, this life-altering, paradigm-shifting moment in time, there is still hope, even in the darkest of times, right? There's survival, and there's a hope and a prayer that we recover from this as a people. And most importantly, as the prophets said, right, as our Isaiahs and Jeremiahs and Ezekiel's, as they all said, that God does not punish forever. God gets mad, maybe. God will provide some sort of a consequence, but eventually the people are forgiven and they're going to be redeemed and restored. So again, even in the most challenging moments, because they're, again, for them, one cannot overstate how completely just altering on the path of human history, forget Jewish history, of human history this moment is. Because this destruction of the temple births, you know, eventually synagogue life and rabbinic Judaism, which in turn helps birth Christianity, as well, right? And so much happens because of this moment that it really changes the course, I would argue, of human history. That, without this one incident in time, right? Again, one can say, I guess, about a lot of things, but I think from a religious standpoint, this one moment really alters what religion and faith are going to look like, and even till today. Any questions so far? Okay. As I mentioned before, some of these themes that I mentioned.
Rabbi, I'm sorry, I'm not technologically savvy, so there's a little
Sure.
delay there. But I do have a question.
Mhm.
Is the Bible something that can never be added to again? Because I mean, the Holocaust is a moment such as this with the
Yes.
rebirth of Israel. I mean, gosh.
Yes. The Bible is closed, so to speak. The canon is closed, but we still write, right? And we still write, we still think, we still have different ideas about what it means to be Jewish, to live a Jewish life. And you're a little ahead of me on it. So that's why it's a great question. I'm going to come to it in a minute. But Lamentations, one of the reasons why this book is so important, I think, is because we think about those other moments of tragedy, right? And we think about how it all relates, that these are emotions, these are feelings that are hard feelings. These are feelings that are difficult, they're challenging, and the questions are challenging, the role of God in suffering. There's so much here that really is penetrating in a way, to our core, because it really speaks about how do we handle the darkest times, not only back then, but also today. And so this book is often read at times of national tragedy, of communal tragedy. And so it's a really great question. And certainly, just to tie it together a little bit, is after the 50s, in the 50s and the 60s, you had Holocaust theology being written. What does Jewish life look like after the Holocaust? What does Jewish life look like with the creation of the state of Israel, right? Like how do we as Jews process that from a theological standpoint, right? From our story, our own narrative as the nation, the people of Israel. And so 100% that we're constantly asking ourselves these questions and sometimes coming up with different answers, depending on the person, depending on the idea. A really good question.
But Rabbi, doesn't it mean read at Tisha B'Av?
Yep, Tisha B'Av. Yep, we're gonna get there, definitely. Tisha B'Av. That's the day. Tisha B'Av literally means the 9th of Av, and that is when this book of Lamentations is read. Is on Tisha B'Av. It's like Tu B'Shvat is the 15th of Shvat, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. Not the most creative names for these days, but that's how it goes. So we read Deuteronomy, we read the prophets, and we get a lot of this. If you do good, good will happen. If you do bad, bad will happen. And certainly Lamentations is written with that theology in mind. We don't have to belabor that point. We certainly have learned a lot about it. Tisha B'Av, as we just spoke about. So Tisha B'Av, 9th of Av, commemorates the destruction of the first temple. But according to Jewish history, Midrash, theology, however you want to put it, we have found a way. We're very creative people. We don't want to be depressed many times during the year. Let's just be depressed one day a year. Let's have to be smaller windows of depression. So every catastrophic event really in Jewish history finds some way to get lumped into Tisha B'Av. And so even before the temple was destroyed, the rabbis say on the 9th of Av, that's when the spies came back from Canaan, in numbers, and didn't want to go into the land. That was Tisha B'Av. That led to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. The first temple, we said. The second temple, again, was seen as Tisha B'Av. The Bar Kokhba rebellion, Tisha B'Av. The beginning of the First Crusade, Tisha B'Av. Expulsion of the Jews from England, Tisha B'Av, expulsion from Spain. Tisha B'Av, you see where this is going, right? World War I started right around Tisha B'Av, right? And the first deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka, right around Tisha B'Av. Give or take, we find a way of folding it in. Does it matter if it's a week off? Not really, right? I mean, you give it enough time, 9/11 is going to be on Tisha B'Av. Some of these other things will be on Tisha B'Av. That's just, it's how it's going to work, right? So these huge moments of tragedy all get linked to this one very dark, very sad day in Jewish history, which is why it is a day. It's a fast day. It's a big fast. My Tisha B'Av story. I had just arrived like a day before. I think it was a day before in Jerusalem for my Year in Israel program. So Elizabeth and I, we came. We're beginning to unpack our boxes. It's sort of getting to the evening. All of a sudden, I hear a knock on the door. I'm like, who's knocking on our door? We just got here. Who do we know? And it turns out it was a friend of mine, a cantorial student. At that time, he's a cantor now, but cantorial student, knocks on my door. Hey, welcome to Israel. And he sort of pulls me outside, and he takes me for a walk, because he had been there many times before. He knew his way around. And so he takes me to the old city, and he's showing me around. I had never been. And then we get to the Kotel, and the Kotel is packed. I mean, it is just teeming. It is bursting with people. And I'm like, what's going on? And he's like, oh, yeah, it's Tisha B'Av. And at Tisha B'Av, everyone goes to the wall because that's the last remaining piece, right, of the temple. So everyone goes, and you see them all in their segments, all in their blocks, the different Haredim, the different ultra-Orthodox in particular. It was really quite a sight. And so I got to pray at the wall on Tisha B'Av. This is all pre-COVID, obviously. I got to pray at the wall on Tisha B'Av. And it was a really powerful moment. Because again, it's that piece of the temple that's still there, and that's why it's considered to be a very holy site. And on Tisha B'Av, it gets very emotional and very packed with people. There are other biblical pieces that are similar. We looked at the Psalms a little earlier in the year. Some of the Psalms, some of them have that sort of mourning, lamenting tone to them. So that kind of poetry, might have influenced this book. There are some ancient Near East parallels, other destruction stories in other communities that sound similar in a way. So again, there's a little bit maybe of influence there. One thing I think that's fascinating for the book is that it is traditionally ascribed to Jeremiah. That Jeremiah, the prophet, he is somebody who, according to tradition, he is actually a witness, right? He witnesses the destruction of the temple. And then he writes down everything. Scholars say not so much. It probably was not written by one person. It's probably more, again, a plurality of authors creating this document. Each has a little bit of a different tone. But one thing everyone agrees upon, pretty much everyone, as much as Jews can agree, but as much as our scholars can agree on something, is that this book was almost certainly written right after the destruction of the temple. That they say it's probably not written a couple hundred years later, that the emotion is too raw. The description of it, the rending nature of the text leads the scholars to believe that the person or people who wrote this actually experienced the moment, right? That they saw it, they felt it, that you almost have to think of this as a eulogy, right? It's almost like a funeral dirge, that the temple, right, like the body sort of the temple of Jerusalem is right before them, right in front of them, and they're wailing, right? They're grieving, they're crying in this moment. It's not like 10 years have passed. They're feeling this very deep, strong emotion right now. And it's very present. The pain is very present in the book. Structurally, again, fascinating. There are acrostics that run throughout the not every scroll, not every part of it, but the first 4 are acrostics. And the last chapter has exactly 22 verses, the letters of the alphabet. Chapter 3 is a triple acrostic, meaning that it goes Aleph, 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 Bet, 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 Gimel, 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 all the way through. So there is some structure, and you might want to think about the idea of, in a chaotic world, right? In a world that's been overturned, what's the response? To create order, right? To create order out of chaos, to find some structure, to find some meaning, which I think is a nice take on that idea. With all of that said, I want to dive into it a little bit. We're going to start actually in Genesis. The first word of the book of Lamentations is Echa, okay? And Echa is translated often as alas, but we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into what that word actually means. So I'm going to share my screen. With all of that said, okay. That's easy that way. Okay, so I'm not going to torment you with the Hebrew. So Sharon, I will a little bit. But Sharon, can you read the English here?
Yes.
This is
They
the
heard-
Adam and Eve story.
Okay. They heard the sound of the eternal God moving about in the garden at the breezy time of day. And the man and his wife hid from the eternal God among the trees of the garden. The eternal God called out to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" He replied, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid.
Excellent. Okay, so we remember the story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then they realize they have no clothes, and so they make themselves some fig leaf, whatever it is. They sort of dress themselves up a little bit. And after this happens, shortly after, it's just, again, the imagery is fascinating. You can spend forever on this story, obviously, as people have. But the idea being that God literally visits them. God sort of pays a house call to them. And God's just sort of walking around the garden. And you can picture God in a way as a parent and looking for the kids. He's looking around, can't find them. And, Adam and Eve are sort of hiding. And then God calls out, "Where are you? Where are you?" God knows where they are, one would assume, but God's calling out, "Where are you?" The word in Hebrew for "where are you," how that is rendered from this Hebrew over here. I'm going to highlight it. Ayeka. Ayeka here is usually rendered as "where are you?" God is searching for the people, so to speak. God is searching for Adam and Eve. Ayeka, where are you? Right? Where are you physically? God probably knows already where they are physically, but maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's where are you emotionally? Where are you spiritually? What's going on? Ayeka, what's happening here? But if we stick to it as physical, it actually works as well with our next text. So Ayeka, where are you? Lamentations 1:1, you see the same letters, right? Echa, it's pointed differently. The vowels are different, but it's the exact same Hebrew letters. And Ayecha, I render here as how, right? How. So Ayecha yashva badad, ha'ir rabati am, hayta ka'almana rabati vagoyim, sariti ba'midinot, hayta lamas. How. Lonely sits the city once great with people. She that was great among the nations is become like a widow. The princess among states is become a thrall. So I render Ayeka not as alas, as it's often rendered, but how. The Hebrew word for how is ech. Ech is how in Hebrew. So echa is a stylized version of it. And that to me is fitting with the idea of the book, because what's the primary question of Lamentations? How? How could this happen? How could this possibly be? How could this reality that we're now experiencing be true? Because it wasn't supposed to happen that way. We didn't believe it could ever be happen that way. But if you wanted to play with it a little bit, you can read Echa as Ayeka, the people calling out to God. Where are you? Just like God was calling out to Adam and Eve, where are you? The people here are calling out, where are you? We're miserable here. We're suffering. We're slaughtered. We're starving. We're sitting here in abject degradation. Where are you? And so I think that's how this starts. Where are you, God, now that we are at our lowest point? With all of that said, let's dive into the text. Gary, you want to pick up there?
Sure. Lamentations chapter 1.
Yeah.
How lonely sits the city, once great with people. She that was great among the nations is become like a widow. The princess among states is become a thrall. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheeks wet with tears. There is none to comfort her of all her friends. All her allies have betrayed her. They have become her foes. Judah has gone into exile because of harsh misery and oppression. When she settled among the nations, she found no rest. All her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places. Zion's road are in mourning, empty of festival pilgrims. All her gates are deserted. Her priests sigh, her maidens are unhappy. She is utterly disconsolate. Her enemies are now the masters, her foes at ease, because Adonai has afflicted her for her many sins. Her infants have gone. I lost my place. Her infants have gone into captivity before the enemy, gone from fair Zion, are all that were her glory. Her leaders were like stags that found no pasture. They could only walk feebly before the pursuer.
Okay, thank you for that. So remember about catastrophe, right? It means overturning. It means something that, is completely shifting, changing, overturning a paradigm, right? So you go right from the very beginning of Echa, how. So what did you have? You had a city that was teeming with people, with life, with energy, with vibrancy, a religious, a theological, a cultural center, right? And now, gone, right? Lonely, by herself. We're going to talk as we go through this a little bit. We have it right off the bat, I guess. We might as well touch upon it now. Is that there's a lot of feminine imagery here, female imagery. Jerusalem as a city is often depicted as female, and the people are also depicted as female in relationship to a masculine God, right? And so God is often the husband, and Israel is the often unfaithful wife, right? And so you're going to have these images of Israel as Jerusalem as a she, as a widow, as an unfaithful wife, etc., etc. So you're going to have this female imagery. So you're going to see she a lot in the text. So she that was great is now a widow. And we remember, again, from our biblical history and from our from Israelite society, that remember we talked about this idea of widows and orphans, right? Widows, orphans, and strangers. That's the big three. They all come together usually in these texts. You protect the widow, orphan, stranger, because those are the three classes of people who are most likely to be abused by society. These are the ones who are most likely to be victimized, by greater society. And so becoming a widow in this context, it's a state of dejection, of almost of powerlessness, and in a way that used to be riding high, used to be great. Now the entire world has come crashing down. The princess, right? So the princess among states is now a servant, right? Is now a thrall. Servant is usually a definition for thrall. She weeps, right, through the night. She's crying. Her face is wet with tears. But she is, again, lonely, right? There's nobody to be around her. There's no one to comfort her. All of her allies have gone away. And in fact, not even only gone away, but they're also now her enemies. And so it paints this picture of isolation. So you imagine during catastrophe, during disaster, that sometimes we feel alone, right? Sometimes we feel cut off, from people during very dark times. That there's a sense of loneliness, of isolation, during this catastrophe. One can relate perhaps to a pandemic, but yes, that there is these moments of loneliness and isolation. Judah has gone into exile because of all this stuff, of this harsh misery and oppression. And there's a sense of restlessness. So even though they've been punished, they're constantly being chased, constantly being hounded. They are sort of running for their lives, trying to find some source of respite, some kind of oasis from everything that's going wrong. But they don't find it. They're constantly moving, running, trying to find some kind of safety, but they don't have it. They overtook her in where? The narrow places. Mitzrayim, right? Mitzrayim, Tsar. It's the place of our surus, right? So that's the narrow places, ones that stress us out. So in those places, we're feeling tight, we're feeling squeezed, we're feeling boxed in when things are going wrong around us. And then again, we have this callback to the very first line. How great, once great with people. Not anymore. The roads are deserted. All the restaurants are empty. All the movie theaters have been shut down. There's no festivals, no partying. Unlike people without masks at the Super Bowl parties, but everyone is, here. Everyone is isolated and alone. And her priests, that were there. Her priests are unemployed, I might add, in this moment, right? The temple's destroyed. They got nothing to do. And so the priests sigh. The maidens are unhappy. Everyone's miserable. Huzzah. And then even the infants, they've gone into captivity. And that the leaders who were once so strong, right? You can be strong. You can be, whatever it is. But if you have nowhere to rest, if you have no nourishment, no sustenance, it's not going to do well for you. You're going to be basically broken down, and they're walking feebly before those who have overtaken them. I told you, not like Ruth, right? There's not as much bright and cheery material. This is definitely some much more serious and much more solemn text. Okay. Bob, you want to pick up here?
At the precious things she had the day of old, Jerusalem recalled the days of woe and sorrow, when the people fell by enemy hands with none to help her. When enemies looked on and gloated over her downfall, Jerusalem was greatly sinned, therefore she is become a mockery. All who admired her despised her, for they have seen her disgrace, and she can only sink and sigh and think back. Her uncleanliness clings to her skirt. She gave no thought to her future. She has sung appallingly with none to comfort her. See, O Eternal, my misery, how my enemy jeers. The foe has laid hands on everything dear to me. She has seen her sanctuary invaded by nations that you had denied admission to your community. See, O Eternal, and behold how abject I have become.
Excellent. So that is another piece here. And really the most important one here that we had, again, this loneliness, right? No one to help. And everyone's laughing at us. Everyone's gloating. Everyone's ha-haing, and pointing at us. And that's what you get, and so it's this idea that we're somehow being mocked. But here is, again, the main point comes out in this sentence. Jerusalem has greatly sinned. and therefore she has become a mockery. There's a cause and there's an effect, right? We have sinned, and now we're paying the price. Now we're becoming a mockery. And so, people who used to look at Israel, look at Judah, and go, "Oh, these people, they must be doing something right. Things are going really well for them. They're thriving in their land." Now it goes the other way, right? Now it is much harder. There's a big fall, so to speak. They plummeted, and those that she thought that were her friends are now laughing at her and saying, "No, like that's what you get." It's not a great scene. And again, there's always no one to comfort, right? It's loneliness. No one's here to help. No one's here to say a nice word. No one's here to provide any kind of reassurance. The enemy is jeering. The foes are laughing. They're coming into the sanctuary. They are, and the people are miserable. They can't find food, and they're selling things in order just to stay alive. During a siege, what's the most precious thing? Water, right? Water and food, right? You have to live. So all of your other stuff, all of your jewelry, all of your finery, all the other material possessions mean nothing, if you can't eat. And so people would sell their stuff, for a bag of potatoes, because you can eat the potatoes, you can't eat a diamond at that point. The diamond's not worth anything. You have to have some kind of sustenance. And so, people would trade, people would try to find a way to make sure they had food during moments of destruction, or else you starve to death. And so, again, things that were going well, not so much anymore. And now here's a little bit more, our next one, Leah. Leah, you want to unmute and read?
Okay. May it never befall you, all who pass along the road. Look about and see. Is there any agony like mine, which was dealt out to me when the Eternal afflicted me on God's day of wrath? From above, God sent a fire down into my bones. God spread a net for my feet. God hurled me backward. God has left me forlorn in constant misery. The yoke of my offenses is bound fast, lashed tight by God's hand. Imposed upon my neck, it saps my strength. The Eternal has delivered me into the hands of those I cannot withstand. The Eternal in my midst has rejected all my heroes. God has proclaimed a set time against me to crush my young men. As in a press, the Eternal has trodden fair maiden Judah.
Okay. Here it begins, though God knows it doesn't end. But here it begins where you get more God language here. You have more about God. Again, it was made clear in the previous text that Jerusalem has sinned and therefore is suffering, but it is very clear, painfully clear, disturbingly clear in a way, that they're making it very much about God and their relationship, that God is the one doing this, not the Babylonians, that God is the one, because God controls everything, right? And so from above, God sent a fire down into my bones. Yikes. Doesn't sound fun at all. But even more so, right? God spread a net for my feet. God has trapped me, right? Like an animal, right? God has trapped me. Has created a snare almost, right? And then chucked me, threw me backwards. And now here I am, tied up, bound, in pain. And that's where God's left me now, in this misery, in that state. I'm tied by this net, but this net is not made of rope, right? The yoke of my offenses is bound fast. So it's all my sins that have tied me up and have entangled me in a way. And God has, sort of cuffed me. God has lashed me, bound me tight. but it's again, it's the sin of my offenses. That's the yoke that's on me. And it's like, a beast of burden, carrying a huge heavy thing, on their back. That's what it is. The weight of our sins is crushing us, and we can't take it off. God has tied it to us in such a way that we have to carry it now. Before maybe we could have gotten rid of it, but now it's actually like a part of us in a way. And with all of that, now we're in the hands of those we cannot withstand, i.e., the Babylonians. The heroes, the young men, they don't stand a chance. It's like we're being crushed, right? We're being crushed. We talk about the barley and the threshing and the winnowing. Maybe it's like a wine press, whatever it is. But like we're being crushed, we're being squeezed. That's the imagery here.
Rabbi.
Yeah. Any questions? Yep.
I think it's brilliant that they refer to Jerusalem as a person with feelings.
Yeah.
It makes it so much easier to understand what happened and what they've gone through. It puts empathy into the whole Lamentations.
Exactly right, because this is about communal suffering, national suffering, but it's very personalized, right? It is very vivid, it's very graphic, and that we imagine the people as a person, that is suffering through, this experience, 100%. And you notice again the use of first person, as well, right? And so that it becomes even more personal in a way that the author themselves is feeling it, is experiencing it. It's very real. I go back to again that funeral imagery. There is a big difference, God willing. It's not always the case, but God willing, a very different experience at a funeral and at an unveiling. Like these are different moments because the pain from the funeral, it still exists, but it's not as present in the same way, at an unveiling 11 months later. Time has passed. It's still sad, it still hurts, that wound is still there, but it's not the same as at the funeral when it's right before you, like right in front of you. This has happened. And so I think here it has that feeling of this is right in front of them right now. They're literally seeing it, they're hearing it, they're smelling, like the burnt, the fires that are there, what's left over, and not to mention to smell the conditions that now exist around them, which are not going to be very lovely. It feels like they're right there at that time, writing it. And I feel like when it comes to those other tragedies, that's why these texts, I think, have proved so powerful in moments of other trauma. That's another good word here, another trauma, is that these are emotions that we have, unfortunately, as a people, experienced enough times, God knows. But even as individuals, we can sort of say it's like this can be how it feels sometimes, even if we don't normally think that way. We can almost sort of feel like, oh God, we're so alone. There's no way out. People who I thought were going to help me, they aren't helping me right now. And maybe even one dares to say, maybe somehow God is testing me. God is punishing me. God's pushing me. Whatever it is. These are emotions that people have experienced, I dare say. Again, maybe some more than others, but I think there are, the emotions that are here, I think, are fairly universal.
It reminds me of in modern times when you refer to Earth as Mother Earth.
Yeah.
You think of Earth as a single person who's hurting, and you can understand more why we have to do what we need to do to be gentle and kind to our Earth.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I think that's a nice connection. 100%. Okay, let's keep it going. Brahms, you want to unmute?
I am ready.
Okay.
For these things do I weep. My eyes flow with tears. Far from me is any comforter who might revive my spirit. My children are forlorn, for the foe has prevailed. Zion spreads out her hands. She has no one to comfort her. The Eternal has summoned against Jacob God's enemies all about him. Jerusalem has become among them a thing unclean. The Eternal is in the right, for I have disobeyed God. Hear all you peoples, and behold my agony. My maidens and my youths have gone into captivity. I cried out to my friends, but they played me false. My priests and my elders have perished in the city as they searched for food to keep themselves alive. See, O Eternal, the distress I am in. My heart is in anguish. I know how wrong I was to disobey. Outside the sword deals death, indoors the plague.
Okay. So we see here, again, similar tropes. You know, we have the idea of this individual just weeping, crying, wailing, and there's no one, again, no one to help, right? There's no aid coming anywhere. There's no one to make them feel any better. You know, this is crushing. Everyone is forlorn, you know, everyone is upset, and there's no comfort. You know, after Tisha B'Av, I'll note, you know, after Tisha B'Av ends, the next Shabbat is a special Shabbat on the calendar. Does anyone know that Shabbat's name? It is Shabbat Nachamu. It is the Shabbat of comfort. It is the Shabbat of consolation. And so we read a text that reads, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. Comfort, oh, comfort my people, right? And so it's a reading from the books of the prophets, that after destruction, after devastation, that we need to speak words of comfort, right? And so, because we know that when we're suffering, we need that. We need comfort. We need consolation. We need support. We need love. And so in this moment, there's no one. There's no one to comfort her. You know, so you have to picture them reaching out, you know, reaching out for help. And there's no one there. And then we get to this section here, that even with all of that, God is right, I am wrong, right? That's the text here, that we're upset, you know, we might be a little angry, we might be a little bit maybe not, but we are very upset, we're very angry, we're devastated. But through that, we understand that even though, you know, that we're in this terrible state, that the people themselves, they by their actions brought along this devastation. And yeah, so I mean, that's what we have here. And again, going back to this idea of a lack of respite, right? That outside, there's the sword. Inside, there's the plague. No matter where you go, it ain't good, right? There's no place to run or hide. Melissa, do you want to pick up there?
When they heard how I was sighing, there was none to comfort me. All my foes heard of my plight and exulted. For it is your doing. You have brought on the day that you threatened. Oh, let them become like me. Let all their wrongdoing come before you, and deal with them as you have dealt with me for all my transgressions. For my sighs are many, and my heart is sick.
And so they had this nice little part at the end that, you know, everyone's sort of pointing and laughing at them, taking pleasure in their pain. A little bit too much schadenfreude, as they say, a little too much pleasure at someone else's misfortune. And so the author here says, you know what? Let all these people laughing at me, it's not nice. Let them experience what I'm experiencing. You know, let them suffer as I am suffering, see how they like it. Let their wrongdoing also come before you and deal with them as you've done with me. Because right now I'm so miserable. My sighs are many and my heart is sick. Which is a pretty intense conclusion, you know, for this chapter. I believe it's the end of the chapter. Okay. Chapter 2. We'll do a little bit of chapter 2, and then I think we'll have enough misery and sadness for one evening. We don't want to overdo it on the sadness. Linda White, you want to unmute?
Alas, the eternal and God's wrath has shamed fair Zion, has cast down from heaven to earth the majesty of Israel. God did not remember God's footstool on God's day of wrath. The eternal has laid waste without pity all the habitations of Jacob. God has raised in God's anger fair Judah's strongholds. God has brought low in dishonor the kingdom and its leaders. In blazing anger, God has cut down all the might of Israel. God has withdrawn God's right hand in the presence of the foe. God has ravaged Jacob like flaming fire, consuming on all sides. God bent God's bow like an enemy, poised God's right hand like a foe. God slew all who delighted the eye. God poured out God's wrath like fire in the tent of fair Zion.
Thank you for that. I will note, and thank you, Linda, for reading that one. It's a little clunky, and I understand that. I instead of having the masculine language, so I put, instead of he and his, I put God in there. So that gives you sentences, like, God has raised in God's anger, instead of saying God has raised in his anger. It sounds a little easier, but I didn't want to include that language. I wanted to sort of have it be more gender neutral, but it does sound a little clunkier here and there. It's a hard passage, aside from that part of it, but it's a hard passage. This idea of what is so fundamental in Judaism, more in a way than the idea of remembering, right? Zachor, Zecher, we remember things. Yisker, we remember those who came before us. We're supposed to remember Shabbat, remember the commandments, remember, how to treat each other. And in this moment, God does not remember us, right? Because we are God's footstool, so to speak. God does not remember us during this time, right? It's as if we passed out of God's memory. Because if God remembered us, how could God let that even happen, right? How could it be? It's like, the favorite child, so to speak. How could this happen in this moment, right? God has destroyed, God has raised in God's anger these strongholds. But to me, the one that stands out the most, it always has, aside from the fire imagery, which I'm going to get to in a minute, is this verse right here. God bent his bow, God bent God's bow like an enemy. God has shot arrows into us. That's just very visceral. It's very graphic. It's very active, in a way that God is causing this. God's creating the fire. God's blowing things up.
He killed beauty. You have the line there. It says he slew all who delighted the eye. He kills beauty.
Kills beauty, 100%. That's right. Like anything that was precious, anything that was meaningful, anything that was important was destroyed. Exactly right. Which, by the way, was part of the reality. It's, in a similar vein, it's the idea that the Babylonians, whoever they didn't kill, they took the creme de la creme, right? They took, everything that they thought had value, and they brought that to Babylonia, including people that they thought had value. They brought them to Babylonia. But those who were the dregs of society, those are the ones who they didn't care about, they left them there to starve to death. They said, like, we're not going to even deal with you. You're not worth it. You're going to stay there. So everything that was sort of like seen as delighting in the eye, things that were seen as important, were taken away. So God poured out God's wrath like fire. This is very intense of a visualization, to imagine that. And this continues a little bit more. Where am I? Debbie Siegel.
Okay. The Eternal has acted like a foe. God has laid waste Israel, laid waste all her citadels, destroyed her strongholds. God has increased within fair Judah mourning and moaning. God has stripped God's booth like a garden. God has destroyed God's tabernacle. The Eternal has ended in Zion festival and Sabbath. In God's raging anger, God has spurned king and priest. The Eternal has rejected God's altar, disdained God's sanctuary. God has handed over to the foe the walls of its citadels. They raised a shout in the house of the Eternal as on a festival day. The Eternal resolved to where did I go? The Eternal resolved to destroy the wall of their Zion. Where am I?
You had it. I just had a little trouble getting it. God measured with a line.
God measured with a line, refrained not from bringing destruction. God has made wall and rampart to mourn. Together they languish. Her gates have sunk into the ground. God has smashed her bars to bits. Her king and her leaders are in exile. Instruction is no more. Her prophets, too, receive no vision from the Eternal.
I mean, this passage, we're going to sum it up fast, but this is really a very important passage because it contains so many very important ideas here. So, of course, the first part is, God acts like an enemy to us, right? God is our friend, God is our guide, God is our teacher, God is our supporter, God is our healer, God are all these things, our sovereign, but now we added another one to the list. God is our foe. God acts like an enemy, to us. Not that God is one, God forbid, but God has acted like that right now. God has turned anger and aggression on us.
It's become the destroyer.
Becomes a destroyer. Exactly right. And something to note here, there's a little alliteration. In the Hebrew, it's much more apparent, but the people who try to translate these things try to give us a sense of it because there's a lot of wordplay, a lot of poetry in the actual Hebrew. And so, but in the English translation, they try to give you some of the feel of it. So they can get phrases like moaning and mourning and moaning. That way you can get some of that alliteration into it. The sukkah, the booth has been destroyed, stripped, right? Stripped it down, destroyed the tabernacle, ended Shabbat. There's no more festival, no more Sabbath. God has spurned and rejected both king and priest. There's symbolism here, right? So the king is the national leadership, right? The king is the authority figure on the secular level, right? So God has burned the secular power in the leader, the national leader, and priest, the religious leader. It's both, right? God has overturned both of these things. We no longer have national leadership, secular leadership, and we no longer have religious leadership. Both of them have incurred God's wrath. God's altar, God's sanctuary, again, these things that are supposed to be home, supposed to be sacrosanct, these have been laid waste. And then it's just that, it's painful, the idea that here you have the enemies coming in, the Babylonians, they're partying in the temple, Ke'ilu, like it was a festive day. So instead of us celebrating Passover and Shavuos and Sukkot, in the temple and singing and laughing and dancing, now it's the sounds of war. Now it's the sounds of anger and of harshness instead. And it's plotted out. God measures it, with a line. It's almost like a carpenter. God is like what I think destroyer is a good word for. I'm thinking like disassembling. It's almost like a demolition. God is saying, here's where this goes, here's where that goes. It goes away. And what else was here? So look, everything is like smashed to bits. Leaders are in exile, but this very last sentence, instruction is no more. There's no more Torah, right? In a way, there's no more teaching happening anymore. And the very last part, which is again very difficult for them, it's that paradigm shift. There's no more communication, right? God has turned off the messenger service. You know, God has disconnected the phone line. The prophets are getting nothing now from God. That has ended. And tradition teaches us that after the destruction of the temple, there's no more prophecy. Prophecy sort of ends here in this generation, where people do not get to communicate with God that way anymore after this. So they're alone, right? And they're alone, and they're calling out, and there's no answer yet. You know, there's no vision, there's no connection. The kings are gone, the priests are gone, the prophets are useless. Okay, so these three pillars of society for them are now gone. So it leads them to a state again of even more of desperation and of melancholy, because the things that they used to rely on are no longer there. And so that is certainly a good reason to lament. Let me see how much longer this chapter is. We still got a little while to go in this chapter. I think that's depressing enough for one evening.
Rabbi, what bars are they referring to? Have smashed her bars to bits.
So in order to keep people out, you know, they would put metal bars into the doors, you know, so that way people wouldn't be able to get in. And so the gates, you know, that used to be there, they've all been overthrown and overturned, including the bars themselves, have all been smashed. So things that they thought would protect them, both physically and spiritually, were no longer there. And it's the world turned upside down, to quote from Hamilton in a way, but the idea that things have changed in a way, and they're not going to be the same. That it's not going to be back to the way it was. Now, of course, as we continue to read the book, we're going to find a little bit more. Look, it's a depressing book. It's called Lamentations, for goodness sake. You know, so it's a spoiler alert. It's not a very cheery book, but there are going to be moments of hope and the understanding of that God does not reject forever, which is really a powerful part of the book. That as bad as things can get, and again, at the time, one can argue different levels of tragedy. You know, one can sort of have that debate on the different levels of catastrophe. But certainly, if you were going to, I wouldn't say rank them, but you know, in terms of catastrophic moments in Israelite history, this was number one at that time. You know, one can argue that we've surpassed that certainly in certain time periods of our history, but at that moment in time, that was it. Like that was the moment in time where their entire life was changed, and they had to create meaning out of suffering. And Lamentations, I would argue, you know, is an attempt to create meaning, but only a little bit, because when we're right in the thick of it, when we're actually experiencing it, one would argue, I would argue, that in that moment, you don't look for meaning as much. That's for later. You know, that goes back to the funeral unveiling analogy, right? You know, when it's right in front of you, you don't think about perhaps the meanings of it. You don't try to find explanations sort of in a way. You sit with your pain. You grieve. You cry. You know, you are in that moment of despair. Later on, there'll be time to analyze and rationalize and try to find other ways of coping. But when tragedy is in front of you, you grieve. That's the natural thing to do. You grieve, you cry, you mourn. And then later on, you find a way to make meaning. And so Lamentations is very much that first phase of, yes, there's a little bit of meaning making in there, you know, certainly. But a lot of it is, how am I experiencing, how am I processing this moment in time. And the Jewish people, and others as well, but the Jewish people have had to do that certainly more than once in our history. But the destruction of the temple, one could argue, I would argue, is again really that first moment of how do you deal with communal, collective tragedy when you don't know what the next day is going to bring, right? When you don't know what's going to happen anymore, because everything that you thought what you were going to rely on has been taken from you. And so how do you then go on? What's the next day look like? Forget the next week, next month, next year. How do we go day to day to move from a very dark place to get to a better place? The story ends okay. We're here. We made it. We took that moment and it spurred, the creation of a different kind of Jewish life and Israelite experience. And that has continued to grow and thrive and develop again till today and in the future. But in the moment, yikes. You got to unmute, Sharon.
Yeah,
There you go.
I'm glad, Rabbi, that you told us that God forgives, that it's not going to last forever, because it's so uncomfortable to read this and know that God is punishing so terribly. Makes it uncomfortable.
It's tremendously uncomfortable as a read, but that's also what pain is. That moment of shock and horror and terror. It's very uncomfortable, and in their theology, and I stress their theology because it doesn't really work for me, but in the theology of Lamentations, it has to be something that they brought upon themselves. The idea that God was meant to protect them, God was meant to help them. So either God dropped the ball, which does not work out well, or we caused God's action. So it's almost powerful in a very different way, that we're saying that our actions have value and they have consequence, and we did not act in a certain way, and therefore it compelled God to act in a different way. Which again, in its own way, is powerful, but to me, it doesn't resonate with me as a message, only just because I don't countenance the idea of a punishing God. Like it just doesn't work for me in that way. That was their way of making meaning. That it had to be something that was through their actions, but after a while, it becomes a little bit too much self-flagellation for my liking, and again putting that sense of theodicy on it, that God working through history, working through justice and injustice, right and wrong, and that we again ourselves are bringing about a punishing deity. It's a little icky for me. Certainly our actions have consequences, right? But it's just a little too easy. I think just to say, you do good, good happens. You do bad, bad happens, and God's gonna smack you if you get out of the line. Doesn't it? To me, I need a little more. I need a little more meat to the bone on that one. Any other questions as we wrap up this very uplifting text?
You gotta go cry.
Yeah, exactly. This is the one, get the Kleenex. We're gonna have one more week of depression, and then we'll hit another text afterwards. I think 2 weeks of Lamentations is enough, and then we'll move on to what's after Lamentations. We up to Esther already? No, Ecclesiastes. Well, we just did Ecclesiastes, didn't we? We just did it. For Sukkot. For Sukkot, we did Ecclesiastes. So, and we're getting close to Purim actually. So Esther will be good to get to. We're actually going to be right on track for Esther. A colleague of mine just wrote a book. I think actually some of us who have grandkids in the area, if they have PJ Library, they might be getting a book called Vashti and Her Comfy Pants. It was written by someone I went to school with, and so this book coming out. And I think PJ is sending it out in certain regions, so be on the lookout if you get that one. So Purim a lot more fun. less bewailing. There's some bewailing there too, but it's not as much the focus of the book. Okay. Great to see everybody as always. Great studying with you. And we will see each other sooner than later, okay? If not before
Thank
next week, then next week.
Thanks.
Good night,
Right.
everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good
Thank
night.
you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.